story you are about to hear may contain detailed descriptions of intense violence. It will certainly be worse than fiction.
Hello, my name is Les. Thank you for joining me as we take a look at a true tale of unimaginable horror. A morning like any other. That's the truth of it when we're talking about January 16th, 1995 in the area around Wadsworth, Illinois. It's the North, so it was cold, of course, like any January day on the western shore of Lake Michigan. It has a unique beauty in the winter, though. It's a kind of rural suburbia. Wadsworth only has about 3,500 residents, but it's just off the interstate, too. Normally rolling and green and obscured by heavy overgrowth in the summer. It's a stark contrast in January. The trees have inexplicably shed their outerwear for winter and reach for the sky all naked and knotty, but failing to conceal that which could be easily hidden in warmer days. In this crossroads at the Wisconsin-Illinois border, you are likely to run into a guy in blaze orange gear and a baseball cap at one of the convenience stores along I-94, and just as likely, a businesswoman traveling between Chicago and Milwaukee in a Mercedes S-Class. It's that kind of place. Cars and trucks on the morning commute belched visible exhaust clouds in the brisk winter air that day, and no matter where you were, a hot cup of coffee was probably a welcome offering. According to local reports, a homeowner who lived near the intersection of Edwards and Hunt Club roads was enjoying morning coffee and letting his German Shepherd named Friendly roam a bit. There are a number of theories on why dogs bring things to their owners. Some say a dog that brings back a dead bird is acknowledging your alpha position in the owner-dog relationship. Others say it's your dog's way of saying thanks, or maybe that your dog is trying to teach you to stalk and hunt prey. I've always believed it's a dog's way of getting praise and petting and belly rubs. After about 40 minutes, Friendly returned home with what he surely must have believed was a good gift for his owner. He's gonna call me a good boy, he must have thought. His owner was horrified to discover Friendly had brought home a human leg. Now that's a hell of a Monday morning. The homeowner called 911 to report Friendly's find, and within 2 hours the police had mounted a massive search of the area that included helicopters, aerial photo analysis, and the expert sniffs and boofs of a revered 140-pound police bloodhound named Sir Lancelot. The search area was big, 6 square miles, from the Wisconsin border on the north to Illinois Highway 173 on the south, and between U.S. Highways 41 and 45. It was a big area to cover, cold and rugged in places. As the search began and word spread in the neighborhood, many wondered what could possibly explain this. Did Friendly bring home part of an uncovered burial from a lost cemetery? Investigators, however, were still expecting to find the rest of a human corpse, because they had seen the leg and they knew it wasn't from a lost cemetery. The Lake County coroner examined the body part. It was the footless leg of a 20-something Caucasian woman and had been very recently severed at mid-thigh with a sharp metallic instrument. We always want to believe the best about ourselves and each other. Nobody likes to face the dark truth so readily apparent if we just stop to look around. Darkness lurks in every corner, quite literally. Nevertheless, we fool ourselves with cliches and platitudes. Sometimes we search for innocent explanations for obviously bad things when our common sense screams otherwise. We so badly want to believe that it's not as bad as it looks. As the police search went on in that third week of January, many wondered whether there wasn't still a logical explanation. They said it was a recently severed leg, ankle to thigh, knee and everything. Obviously not a long-buried cemetery interment. Some moved on to the next conclusion. Could it be part of a corpse for medical research? The search party continued until sundown Monday night as the buzz grew and then resumed Tuesday and continued for the entire day. The authorities apparently expected to find the rest of a human corpse rather quickly because after a couple of days of finding nothing, frustrations began to mount. One of the dog handlers, Lieutenant Steve Townsend, said, "There's more little itty-bitty paths that run here, there, and everywhere than you can imagine. It's astronomical." Some started to question how one leg could be found but not the rest of the body, and jumped to the conclusion that perhaps a killer was scattering his victim's remains. The frustration showed in the January 18, 1995 Chicago Tribune quote of Corporal Kurt Coursey, who said, "You can theorize all you want. Was something throwing body parts out of a moving vehicle? Who knows? We don't even have a starting point." Diligent search notwithstanding, they were thwarted by their inability to recover any other remains. Nothing turned up and the authorities called off the search. "We're at a stalemate," Corporal Coursey said. "Gross as it may sound, the next thing we need to find is another body part." If you're a fan of horror movies, you know there are all kinds. Slasher, art house, psychological, grindhouse. But what they all have in common is the ability to shock and horrify us in a way that we can't believe is real, that we don't want to believe is real, that we are afraid we might find out is real. What then do you do if you encounter one of those moments in real life? The kind of thing that makes you say, "Shut the fuck up, this isn't happening." But it's not a movie, and you can't shut it off. 5 days after the first event, Friendly the German Shepherd returned home with another human leg. The other human leg. It appeared to belong to the same corpse that the first leg had come from, and whereas the first leg had been obviously fresh, the second leg appeared to have been buried. Adding further clarity to the situation, Lake County Coroner Barbara Richardson had by this point determined that the first leg had been severed at mid-thigh with a toothed blade, likely a hacksaw. It was not the kind of thing you would expect to find from a cadaver donated for medical research. They were searching for a homicide victim. Police conducted further searches of the woods where Friendly found the human legs, but again, could not find the rest of a human corpse. Where the hell is this dog getting these legs? They had to raise their game. Investigators fitted Friendly with an electronic tracking device. They would let him out for a run and then follow him to wherever he went, wherever he was finding these body parts. That sounds like a great idea in concept, but it didn't quite work out the way they hoped. Friendly reportedly got confused by the hubbub and the tracking device and refused to take part. He never led investigators to a corpse. While the investigator search parties let the local German Shepherd run up a 2-0 lead on him, the forensic investigators were hard at work analyzing the DNA of the initial leg. It took 7 weeks before they were able to trace the DNA to 2 local people that they believed were the parents of the dead woman. She was a 25-year-old from Carroll Stream, Illinois, named Stacy Frobel. As they always do, investigators dug into the life of the victim to answer the question, who is Stacy Frobel? And as they frequently do, they found a troubled background and a difficult investigation in front of them. Stacy Frobel had a complicated backstory. Imagine this humiliation. Your entire life, your biological father denies his paternity, but finally admits to a newspaper reporter that he's your dad when the DNA from your murder investigation traces back to him. It was a cruel twist that they were finally able to confirm Stacy's biological father's identity through a DNA test intended to investigate her death. The man's name was Willard Russell, an electrician who lived in the Nashville area. He told local press that he had never been convinced he was Stacy's father, but the police DNA test finally confirmed it for him. "There's a sense of loss. It was evidently my child," Russell told the Daily Chronicle. "After 25 years and not even believing it was my child, well, there's a lot of mixed emotions." He had been married to Stacy's mother for just a few months in 1970. Stacy herself had been married before as well. As a young, expectant mother, 8 months pregnant, Stacy's husband punched her in the stomach in a fit of rage that caused Stacy to call the police. Her husband, just 21 years old, hung himself with his flannel shirt just 15 minutes after they closed the door of his jail cell. Stacy was left to give birth and raise her son Daniel on her own. Perhaps it's not surprising, though, after that kind of trauma, that a few months later, Daniel ended up in the care of his grandmother while Stacy continued searching for what we all search for, our happiness, our place in the world. The investigation was already looking daunting when investigators discovered at the time of her disappearance, not only was Stacy married, but she also had a boyfriend. There were multiple avenues that detectives would have to explore: revenge, grudges, love triangles. Stacy Frobel's husband, Jeffrey, had reported her missing on January 4th, and a few who watched the local crime blotter closely had seen her name and speculated whether the legs found by Friendly might belong to Stacy Frobel in the days leading up to the confirmation. Now, investigators wanted to know everything about the Frobels' marriage. One media account said neighbors reported they fought a lot and that Stacy would sometimes leave the house afterward. Likewise, the boyfriend was under suspicion. He was only ever identified in the press as an unnamed Berwyn, Illinois man. Along with her husband, Jeffrey, Stacy's boyfriend was questioned and agreed to take a polygraph. You wonder if this was the moment when police believed they had their man. One of these two guys has got to be the guy, right? Both men passed their polygraph tests. Police were forced to admit defeat, back to square one. The authorities issued a statement, admitted the men had each passed a polygraph, and said they didn't intend to question them again unless new information came to light. The disappearance of Stacy Frobel and the discovery of her legs in the woods in rural Lake County was a hot topic of discussion in 1995, and the longer the case went without answers, the more it was on the mind of local residents. On March 23rd, it was reported a man who owned rental property in the vicinity of Edwards and Hunt Club Roads had become convinced that the discovery of human body parts in the neighborhood was hurting his ability to rent his property. He had a 30-acre wooded property that he normally had no trouble renting. Lately, though, things had been different. Who wants to rent a place in a neighborhood where the dogs regularly come home with body parts but the police can't find them? Yeah, sounds great. The more I hear it, the more I like it. Do you take Bitcoin? Frustrated, the property owner hired Kay Watt of Springfield and her trained cadaver search dog, Hawthorne, to search his property. He hoped the dog would clear his property and put his mind at ease, and he could then reassure buyers that there were no body parts still to be discovered on the property. Within 2 hours, the dog had discovered a human skull in an area that was described as densely wooded underbrush in a swampy area. Preliminary examination determined it resembled Stacy Frobel's skull, and the identity of the skull was confirmed through dental records from a 1987 dentist visit in Denver. It was the skull of Stacy Frobel. These dogs. The Post-Crescent observed, only dogs seem to know where the evidence is hidden. There's nothing rational about the case. There are so many twists and turns, Corporal Kurt Corsi said. Days later, and a couple miles away, a homeowner working in her Bristol, Wisconsin yard found what appeared to be a human hand. It was not an old, decomposed remnant of a human corpse. The hand was in good enough condition that fingerprints could be taken, and they matched Stacy Frobel's prints. Not long after, in April, the skeletal remains of Stacy's foot were found in yet another disparate location. Although it is possible Stacy's remains may have been partly strewn about by animals, it was clear Stacy Frobel had been thoroughly dismembered before her body parts were scattered in the region by her killer. Over the spring and summer of 1995, Illinois and Wisconsin authorities participated in a very active investigation, but publicly, there were no immediate answers about who killed Stacy Frobel. Behind the scenes, however, police had a prime suspect they had started investigating in the spring. Police retraced Stacy's movements on the night she disappeared, and it didn't take long to determine she had last been reported leaving the house of an acquaintance, Charlene Runge, in Streamwood, Illinois, just after midnight on the morning of January 4th. Police discovered Charlene Runge was married to a man named Paul Runge. Clean-cut, athletic type with a barrel chest, kind of the high school basketball ref look. If he was a convicted sexual sadist who raped and tortured a 14-year-old girl in his home when he was 17, because that's who he was. He reportedly waited until his dad and brother left him home alone, then lured the girl to his home and tortured and raped her over 15 hours. He was convicted and spent 5 years of a 14-year sentence in prison. Investigators noticed one particular thing. On the day after Stacy Frobel went missing, Paul Runge called in sick to his job at Lady Foot Locker and continued to miss days until he eventually quit. The focus on Paul Runge intensified. By June of 1995, the police put the Runges under periodic surveillance as they continued to investigate, hoping for a slip-up that would let them connect Paul Runge to Stacy Frobel's murder. A forensic dentist compared Runge's teeth impressions to bite marks found on Frobel's remains and deemed them consistent. There is some hesitancy to view bite mark evidence as reliable in our present criminology, but in 1995 it was considered strong evidence. They used luminol, which revealed blood on the trunk liner of Runge's car. DNA was in its infancy, and the best they could do was say it was type A blood, the same as Stacy Frobel, but also the same as about 3 or 4 out of every 10 people, period. Paul Runge was aware he was under surveillance and, damning evidence notwithstanding, would sometimes wave to the cameras or tip a hat to the hard-working investigators, staking him out from behind a newspaper in the white Mercury Sable parked at the curb. He seemed unperturbed under the lens of the magnifying glass. Authorities would later say they surveilled the Runges on 286 occasions over 2 years, and it can only be considered ironic that their single-minded focus on finding Frobel's killer would later prove to be a mistake with deadly consequences. Zanita and Amila Pasambogovic were 22 and 20 years old, respectively. Zanita's nickname was Janet, and with her sister, she had recently immigrated from Bosnia. They hadn't even been in the country for 6 months when, in May, they moved to a new apartment on Leslie Lane in Hanover Park, Illinois. 2 months later, on July 11th, both women disappeared. On a side tangent, it should be pointed out in researching this podcast, a search of Illinois and Wisconsin newspaper archives for Stacy Frobel's name in 1995 and 1996 turned up dozens of results. Her story had been covered by dozens of reporters and news outlets. A search for news on the Pasambogovic sisters turned up 3 results for 1995 and 0 for 1996 through 2001 when their killer was named. Take from it what you will. It was August 8th, a month after they went missing, when the local paper reported police suspected foul play in the disappearance because the sisters vanished without their passports and all their belongings were left in their apartment. Just as they had discovered a link between Stacy Frobel and Paul Runge, her friendship with his wife Charlene, investigators made numerous links between Runge and the sisters. Paul Runge's co-worker at a honey-baked ham store in Bloomingdale, Illinois, told police she gave Charlene Runge a phone number for the 2 Bosnian sisters. The Pasambogovic sisters were interested in finding work, and Charlene was allegedly planning to start a cleaning business. Also, a gas station payphone used by Charlene Runge was found to have dialed the sisters' phone number shortly before they disappeared. Remember, this is before mobile phones were widespread, but the Runges had a phone in their home. Investigators found it odd. Why were they using a payphone? And déjà vu, the day after the sisters disappeared, Paul Runge called in sick to the Honey Baked Ham store and eventually quit just like he had at Lady Foot Locker after the murder of Stacy Frobel. Despite the scrutiny, investigators did not find the sisters' remains. Without bodies, they did not yet feel they had enough evidence to charge the Runges. In January of 1996, the Kenosha News shouted a headline, "Murder probe focuses on one suspect." All cards were on the table. There was no longer any question who the police were zeroed in on. Lake County Sheriff's Lieutenant Chester Ewan said, "We have focused on this individual suspect for some time. We have talked with him. I'm sure he's aware of the fact that we're looking at him." Of course, the police made a point to investigate all likely suspects. I'm sure they would give the boilerplate "we considered all suspects" line if asked, but they were practically salivating at the evidence they had gathered on convicted felon and rapist Paul Runge. By March of 1996, the authorities felt they had pulled together enough evidence for a search warrant of Runge's home. There are conflicting reports about how the authorities got permission to search the Runge's home. In one published account, a judge simply granted the search warrant based on the evidence. However, the Chicago Tribune reported Paul Runge's father, Richard, who also lived there, gave the FBI permission to search their home. Shortly afterward, 7 bags of garbage appeared at the curb for collection, and the police found evidence connecting Runge to the Posambogovic sisters in the trash. The search revealed a piece of paper with the co-worker's name on it and the phone number for the Posambogovic sisters. The co-worker had given Charlene the sister's number, just like she said she had. Detectives also found contact information for other women with descriptions like single, mid-30s, cute, easy, and very hot blonde with 2 hot sisters. It was all damning, but investigators were seeking something, anything, to specifically connect Paul Runge to the killing of Stacy Frobel. They found a large Viper brand knife, a stun gun, and a crossbow with several dozen bolts, but the search did not reveal anything that tied Paul Runge to the murder of Stacy Frobel. Paul Runge remained a free man. While investigators sat on their hands, a madman was on the loose, murdering indiscriminately. His crimes accelerated in early 1997 and turned into 10 weeks of terror. In January 1997, the remains of Dorota Dorothy Zubiak, a Polish immigrant, were found in the burned ruins of a far northwest side home she was trying to sell. Autopsy results showed she had been raped and strangled before the home was set on fire. Weeks later, on February 3, 1997, a killer showed up at the door of Yolanda Gutierrez and her daughter, 10-year-old Jessica Muniz. He was working as a driver for a 7-Up bottling company. Gutierrez was selling Hooked on Phonics and had put up a notice on a grocery store bulletin board. She couldn't know that the guy in the 7-Up uniform with the hand truck was getting an eye full of her. Her killer used the ad as a ruse to get in the apartment. Once inside, he raped and murdered the woman and her daughter by stabbing them in the neck, then set the apartment on fire. 6 weeks later, on March 14, 1997, Kazimira Perush was found dead in her burning condo on North Kenneth Avenue. It had been advertised for sale in a classified ad. I can't imagine there's a worse feeling than being a homicide investigator watching a perpetrator get away with it again and again, but that's what detectives were faced with. Paul Runge was killing at will, and everybody was powerless to prove it, to stop it. In May of 1997, someone finally realized they had made a gross error in investigating Paul Runge back in March of 1996. Paul Runge was a convicted felon. He wasn't allowed to have the knife or a crossbow with ammo. The police could have jailed him on parole violations 15 months earlier, but later admitted they were so focused on connecting him to Stacy Frobel's murder that they simply overlooked the parole violation. In those 15 months, 4 more women died. If you count the Posambogovic sisters, 6 women died while Runge was under police suspicion and surveillance. In June of 1997, Paul Runge was arrested and jailed on a parole violation for weapons. With Runge back in prison, his wife Charlene started offering information to the authorities in an effort to save her own ass. As Runge's sentence for the parole violation was about to run out in 1999, the authorities went to court seeking to keep him imprisoned under the Sexually Violent Persons Act. The outcome was still pending when the final big break came. An investigator working the case for the murders of Yolanda Gutierrez and her daughter Jessica had an entirely different suspect in mind. Like I said, they'd investigate all suspects. The detective compared their suspect's DNA against the murderer and found it was not a match. On a hunch, they ran the DNA against Paul Runge's profile. Initial tests were ruled inconclusive due to Runge's original DNA being analyzed with an older, outdated technology. They were eventually able to adapt Runge's profile with current technology and match his profile to the murders of Yolanda Gutierrez and Jessica Muniz. Faced with the evidence, Runge confessed to multiple murders, including Stacy Frobel, the Posambogovic sisters, Dorothy Zubiak, and Kazimierza Parush. On June 15, 2001, Paul Runge was big news. The Chicago Tribune ran a headline, front page above the fold: "Man charged in 7 slayings." It had been 6 years since Friendly the German Shepherd returned home with the partial remains of Stacy Frobel. Right from the jump, press coverage was critical of the glaring errors on the part of law enforcement. The subheading on the story read, "He was under surveillance after first death." It can hardly be laid bare with any more savagery than the description from the Chicago Tribune. 5.5 months after the death and dismemberment of a young woman in January 1995, federal and local authorities began watching Runge. They searched his rental car and found traces of blood. They studied his phone records, even searched the trash bags outside his Carroll Stream house, records show. Investigators trailed him, with Runge sometimes waving at them tauntingly, and through it all, Runge kept killing, police say. Devastating. The FBI tried to save face and did a pretty shitty job of it. Ross Rice, a spokesman for the FBI in Chicago, said, "We never felt that any of these items, including the knife in and of itself, would be a parole offense, nor were we looking to violate his parole. We were looking for evidence linking him to the disappearances and/or linking him to the murder of Frobel." Furthermore, investigators have steadfastly justified their inconsistent surveillance by saying they were focused on connecting Runge to Stacy Frobel, not on catching him in the act of committing another crime. What about the Posambogovic sisters? Most of what we know about the murder of the Posambogovic sisters comes from Paul Runge's confession. DuPage County State's Attorney Joseph Burkett said Runge handcuffed the sisters, raped, bludgeoned, and strangled them, then dismembered them, put their remains in plastic trash bags, and scattered them among area trash bins. These 2 beautiful young women escaped the hell of war-torn Bosnia, Burkett said, only to encounter Satan in the person of Paul Runge here in the United States. As of this writing, their remains have never been found. In October of 2000, Runge and another inmate were charged with escape when they fled from a van while being transported to a hearing in Cook County. They were immediately recaptured by law enforcement personnel who happened to witness the event. In 2006, the law caught up to Paul Runge when he was sentenced to death for the murders of Yolanda Gutierrez and Jessica Muniz. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Runge's sentence became something of a political football. Illinois was under a moratorium on the death penalty, and proponents of capital punishment labeled Runge as the poster boy example of a predator that deserved execution. From the Chicago Tribune story, Cook County State's Attorney Richard Devine called the slayings vicious and brutal, saying he hoped the case might force a decision on where Illinois stands on capital punishment and perhaps spur movement on whether the moratorium in place since 2000 should end. If ever there were an appropriate candidate for the death penalty, it's Paul Runge, Devine said. Nevertheless, Illinois abolished the death penalty in 2011, and Paul Runge's sentence was commuted to life without parole. Paul Runge awaited trial for the murder of Janet and Amala Pasambagovic for years, but in 2011, without bodies or other evidence, prosecutors decided to drop charges against Paul Runge because he could not be sentenced to any greater penalty for killing the sisters. As reported by Nancy Hardy of News Radio WBBM in 2001,
Runge is already serving life for the 1997 rape and murder of a Chicago woman and her 10-year-old daughter. His death sentence was commuted by Governor Pat Quinn when he abolished capital punishment in March. The Daily Herald reports the DuPage County State's Attorney will dismiss charges in court today against Runge for the 1995 murders of two sisters in Hanover Park. Cook County prosecutors dropped 3 murder cases against the 41-year-old former Carroll Stream resident after Quinn abolished the death penalty.
There are so many unanswered questions. Obviously, question number 1 seems to be what was wrong with Paul Runge? We know very little about his childhood except that he was local, raised in the Oak Forest, Illinois area, without any reported incidents until some said they noticed a shift in him when his mom died in 1987. Not long after, he violently raped a 14-year-old girl and went to prison at the age of 17. A former babysitter described him as quiet, but maybe a little strange, and noted one odd thing. His parents had installed a lock on Paul's bedroom door. Was that because of who he was, a violent psychopath? Or was that the reason he became who he was, cruel, neglectful parents who would lock him in his room? What else played a part in Paul Runge becoming a monster? I'm not an educated expert on the issue, but I don't think people become sexual sadists without experiencing some kind of sexual trauma themselves. The current science on sexual sadists says that they feel the pain of the people they torture more than normal people, and they enjoy it. Except when it's over, sometimes they regret it. Statistics show sadists are likely more common than you think they are, and come in an everyday variety. Think about it. You probably recognize them. The guy who blows up an online game for no apparent reason. An internet troll or office bully. Believe it or not, 6% of college undergrads admitted getting sadistic pleasure from hurting others. 6%. Sadism comes in little swatches of gray that get progressively darker, from harmless sex play between consenting adults down the stairway of depravity. Frequently overlooked, however, is sadism as a predictor of greater aggression against both innocent targets and perceived adversaries. According to our current science, to be diagnosed with sexual sadism, an individual must be recurrently aroused by or participating in sadistic sexual acts for at least 6 months, and his or her life must be hindered socially or occupationally by such behavior. Paul Runge was the textbook case, the extreme end of the scale when it came to his sadism, and it was matched by his propensity for aggression and violence. Did someone else victimize Paul Runge as a child? And has that predator also been brought to justice? The answers are not clear. We ask these questions not because Paul Runge deserves our attention or our sympathy, but because, well, you know what they say, know thy enemy. And if we want to stop monsters like him in the future, we have to hold responsible each and every offender who plays an evil hand in creating monsters like Paul Runge. How do we keep ourselves safe from monsters like Paul Runge? Good question. You know, the standard fare. Be aware of your surroundings at all times. Don't open your door for strangers, as you've learned in previous episodes of this podcast. Sadly, you can't trust anyone anymore, and they say you shouldn't use grocery store bulletin boards, post for sale signs in your yard, or try to sell your home independently, not without taking extreme precautions at least. Basically, avoid any situation where you'll find yourself alone with a stranger in isolated places, or arm yourself. This is what it's come to. Were there other victims? Police believe there were. Runge allegedly confessed to murdering an unidentified prostitute for which he was never charged, and there may have been others. In the course of researching this story, it became abundantly clear that being alone, face-to-face with Paul Runge when his otherwise absolutely normal appearance and demeanor outside changed to homicidal psychopath right before your eyes once he was inside your home. It's bone-chilling to imagine. Not many who witnessed it survived it, so we can only guess how many there might have been. We can be outraged at a failed investigation that cost too many lives, multiple officials who dropped the ball. Everyone who hears this story is sick with anger at the monster Paul Runge, and the people and circumstances that created him and allowed him to prey on the innocent, the troubled, the unfamiliar. And the price was too damn high. Dorothy Zubiak was a single mom and left behind a 5-year-old daughter, Ashley, orphaned to be raised by her grandparents. She reportedly has few memories of her mom. Every one of Paul Runge's victims had a family. Mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and sons and daughters. And none of them deserved to have their loved one ripped away from them in such a nightmarish fashion. They're survivors. They just cling to whatever it is they have and try to get through it. In 2001, Susan Eberly, who was raising Stacy Frobel's son Daniel, said, "It's hard raising a boy on my own again, but he has her laugh, her mannerisms, her feet. We would all wish that she was here raising her son." Daniel was 5 when his mom disappeared, 11 at the time of the interview. Eberly said Daniel had some memories of his mom, like ice skating, and he could remember their own New Year's Eve celebration 3 days before his mom disappeared on January 4th, 1995. Stacy bought a bottle of sparkling grape juice for the kids to have as their champagne, Susan Eberly said on the verge of tears. He still has that bottle. That'll do it for this episode of Worse Than Fiction. I want to thank you for listening. Thank you for sticking through the break. Hopefully I can start putting out more stuff more quickly. I have enlisted the services of Mr. Troy Larson to help with writing. He's going to write an episode every once in a while, so that's good. Do all the things, go all the places, hit all the thumbs up and whatnot. You know what to do. Until you hear from me again, goodbye.